So for this particular weekend, we decided to participate in the Smithsonian Free Museum Day, which is when the Smithsonian reaches out to multiple museums across the US and they decide to allow people to go in free of admission. So we went to two places that participated in this. It was the first one that we went to was the Moffett Field Museum, and the second one we went to was the Ames NASA Visitor Center. And so what we did was we got there at about 11 in the morning, and we took some pictures outside, took some pictures of the hangar. It was really cool. And then when we went in, all I had to do was show my phone, which had the free tickets on there, and we went straight in. And this place is filled with tons of memorabilia and a lot of really unique and interesting relics from history, things that were genuinely actually in the wars or aircrafts or anything like that. So they had a lot of really cool things to look at and a lot of detail to all of it. The first thing that we noticed were military uniforms. They had both the formal occasion uniforms by both men and women, and by each item they also had photographs of the people who had donated these items or were at least putting them out on loan to the museum. So these are actual parts of private collections. And then they also had the field uniforms or tactical uniforms that were used while people were on their crafts or, out fighting a war. So it was really interesting to see. These were the genuine uniforms. They were not replicas. And they had them pretty much all over the place. There was one room in another section of a hangar that had probably, I would say, 20, possibly up to 30 of these types of uniforms lined up. Everyone from Rosie the Riveter type uniform jumpers to like 5-star general type uniforms, and so it was really interesting to look at and really cool to see. The next item that we noticed were dining hall plates. So these were anything from standard mess hall tins to the silver and china that were eaten off of by like admirals and captains and first mates and whatnot. So every level of command had their own dishware set, so they had all those on display. Also parts of private collections. These were not replicas, they were all on loan. So that was also really neat to see. The next item was actually a very large part of the museum, and mostly being because the hangar that is on Moffett Field is actually one for blimps or hot air balloons, so to speak. So they created two types of hot air balloons, the first type being a weaponized blimp. And the initial intention was for the Air Force to create a fleet of blimps called the Dreadnoughts. It was based off of the similar idea that the Germans had at the same time to create a hot air balloon or blimp fleet. Once it was kind of discovered that they couldn't do so effectively and efficiently, they decided against it, and instead they created a mothership of a blimp, and they called her the trapeze artist, I believe, and her insignia was two trapeze artists. The main reason being that this mothership could carry 4 reconnaissance airplanes, and each airplane had a hook on top. And the mechanism that they used for each plane to ride within the mothership was called a trapeze, and it was basically a small bar that would lower from the mothership, and the very skilled pilots would have to hook their planes onto these trapezes, and it would be lifted up, and also they would refuel, and then they would go back down and do reconnaissance or search and rescue as well. Now, up to 4 planes were on this ship, so each one had to have a very skilled pilot. So it was very interesting to see that, a very cool history, and one that's not generally touched upon in history books. Like, this was the first time I'd ever heard of any sort of blimp being weaponized or used at wartime. With this method, they were able to cover, I believe it was 120,000 square miles more in search and rescue and reconnaissance over the ocean, because the airplanes would not need to use any fuel to get to the center of the ocean. it would all be relied upon the blimp. So then afterwards they would be lowered out in the middle of the ocean so they could fly anywhere from that section. So it was a very good idea, stemmed from the failed fleet section. And once again, the fleet's not really touched upon in history all that much, so it was very fascinating to see exactly the reasoning behind this huge hangar and why it's so oblong shaped. The other part was that they made regular hot air balloons. They were covered in an off-white canvas, and they were simply printed with either Navy or Army on them. And they looked and were structured like pretty much any stereotypical hot air balloon, except they weren't colorful. And I believe they were used mainly for show, it seemed. I recall reading a little bit about possible reconnaissance, about making sure that topographical maps and whatnot were accurate. But beyond that, they were never weaponized or used within a war, because as you can imagine, a regular hot air balloon is probably not the best way to travel through any sort of war zone. The next item that we noticed was a dog tag machine, and on it had a small sign that said personalized dog tags for $5. So I participated in purchasing one. I picked up a small form, filled out everything that I needed to fill out, and waited my turn, because since it was a free day and it was on the weekend, it was quite busy there, and so there were a lot of different people there who wanted to get dog tags. Now, there was only one person in charge of it, so there was a bit of a wait, but she got to everyone, and she's very skilled at the actual machine because it's a very old mechanical machine. She would familiarize herself with everything that was written on the form before she even turned the machine on, because she wanted to make sure that she understood everything that she would need to write. Because as you can imagine, once you make a mistake, you have to start with a whole new dog tag. The machine itself had running gears on it with the symbols on each gear, and every time she would depress a key, it would actually stop on that key, on that symbol in the spinning gears, and depress it into the dog tag. It was a very, very cool thing to watch. We did witness her mess up on one, and it actually pulled the dog tag all the way out, as if to say like, okay, this dog tag is ended kind of deal. So we saw her have to restart another one because it's so old and mechanical. You had to be very careful with it. I put on my dog tag, I put my personal information on there and a personal motto, and I have it on my keyring, and I do wish I got a second one because I really do love it so much. It's such a unique item, and it'll always, say what you want it to say. The next item that we noticed in the museum were a ton of model airplanes that were hanging from the ceiling. Now, these model airplanes were all more or less the same color as far as I could tell, and they were mainly concentrated towards the entrance from the museum section to the hangar section. And so it was very easy to kind of get lost in the detail because there were so many things. There were uniforms and descriptions and clippings of newspapers, and then if you look up, there's a ton of different model airplanes, all spanning throughout the entire history of flight, so to speak. So they had the, kind of like a model of the Kitty Hawk back from North Carolina all the way up to the most recent Air Force planes and stealth fighter jets and whatnot. So those were very cool to see. One thing that we noticed when we go in from the museum section to the hangar section is that there is a small separated area that has a ton of different war plaques and names and memorabilia and items of honor, so to speak. So awards and a bunch of different pins that you'd generally see on labels. Dedicated in memory to the fallen soldiers, people who were lost, people who passed away, who participated in any and all of these aircraft missions, or creating it, or just running it. And one thing that really sticks out is a dinner set laid out with 2 eternal burning candles that are dedicated to the brothers who cannot dine with us tonight. I found that very moving and very interesting, and next to it was a binder filled with names that they update pretty much every month of the people who have passed away. and you'll see on certain on certain items that were donated that some of them were actually donated in honor of that person because they did pass away. Once again, reaching to the fact that these are genuine pieces of history, not just replicas. Another item that was really interesting was the practice plane for pilots. So it was a modular structure made of wood, and then it had a bunch of little control items in it, like joysticks and switches and triggers and whatnot, so that pilots could actually practice flying within the safety of pretty much an exact replica of the craft that they were going to pilot. So it was a lot of different details, very complicated looking. It looks like it would take a long time to figure it out. I imagine this is why they would sometimes have 2 pilots in any given craft, but it was very cool. The next item, which is pretty similar to the previous one, was a cockpit that you could sit in. Now, Charlie and I did not sit in the cockpit. However, we did witness other guests go, and they were able to sit in there so long as they were accompanied by one of the kind of tour guides or just one of the museum people who were there. And it was really cool looking, really neat. I remember doing something similar at like Boeing and a couple other museums of flight. But it was a very interesting segment of the plane to see and to be able to look into. The outdoor hangar had separate sections of, the outdoor hangar had different planes and different aircraft in general. There was like a helicopter there and something of a shuttle, and it was very cool to see because you could see the structure of it all. You could see what when they were updating some of the pieces to, I guess, weatherproof it a little bit more. A lot of people were there like kind of maintaining them, it seemed, and then there was also a very old plane that was behind some caution tape that was very clear that they were restructuring it. So it seemed to be also parts of like, not necessarily personal collections, but it was a very small collection of planes, most likely donated through either personal or public charity. And they were very, very interesting to look at. They're very old too. So that was basically the Moffett Field Museum. Truly fascinating, absolutely loved the place. I do want to go back. I think it's definitely worth the second trip. My personal favorite, which I'm not sure if we got footage of, was the newspaper clippings. There was a collection from a man who had started collecting them since the 20s of very important dates and newspaper clippings of major world events. A lot of really cool, genuine clippings, all of them based within either Seattle or San Francisco, because that's where he resided within, and truly fascinating to see these actual prints and not just replica prints like I have. So that was probably my favorite part, absolutely. So after that, we went to lunch, and then we returned to the same area to go to the Ames NASA Research Visitor Center. Now, this place is generally apparently free to the public every day. However, in honor of the Smithsonian Free Museum Day, they had special guest speakers and they had other videos that they were planning to show. My brother and I were able to attend 2 of these items, and they were truly fascinating, and we learned a ton of new things about the Ames Research Center and about NASA in general. So one of the coolest things, and one of the first things I noticed when I walked in, was an enormous sphere that had the world projected on it, and it's absolutely gorgeous, and it just spins, and it's a very nice centerpiece to the visitor center, and it just feels very appropriate because these images were captured by the satellites and whatnot that NASA had contributed. So the fact that we have all this information is because of something amazing. The next thing was the NASA helmets for the pilots and astronauts. So what they were, how they were created, the history of them, and and how we progressed with them from having like sun-shaded ones to having like total visible ones to having those all-glass ones, so to speak, that you see in like sci-fi movies. They entertained a lot of different ideas, but of course safety was the first concern of theirs, so they always wanted to make sure that it wouldn't fail. So they had a lot of different prototypes, all of which were on display, and they were really fascinating. And each suit, I believe they were genuine. I don't recall too many replicas. I think there was maybe one or two, but the rest of them, they were dirty. They had definitely seen use and seen wear. They even had prototype test ones that were out there that were really cool looking as well. They had a really cool model rocket as well. Now the models all had, they were all like to scale. They had like a certain scale to them, and they would also show you mechanically what was going on inside of them, be it on the actual model, or they would have photographs of mechanically what things did inside and how they would run. So it was really informative, really interesting. I remember one of their research labs, so to speak, was a really cool metal box with porous glass, and above there's pressurization for the chamber and whatnot. So there should be some footage of that there. One item of pride that they seem to have was a moon rock, of course. I imagine every space center needs to have one of these, because I'm sure several were collected. And it's in a special segregated room where you can go in, and it's encased in its own chamber that I'm sure is monitored and temperature moderated and whatnot. But it was very cool to look at. And then they also had on display similar rocks that had similar composition from Earth, and you can touch those, but you cannot touch the moon rock. If you want to do that, you have to go to, I believe, Washington, D.C. The different items that they had there were like different models of drones or droids that they had sent to space already, being for the Mars Curiosity rover, spanning 2 satellites or Sputnik, so to speak. They had different models of these items there as well. A lot of them were to scale, and if they weren't to scale, they were actual parts of the actual drones themselves. So it was very interesting to take a look at those sections and those segments. Now there were two presentations we were able to participate in. One of them was a scientist who studied bone density and pretty much the physiological effects of space in the human body, and he did a really good job explaining what he had to do and what their concerns were for astronauts up in space. And because the longer you spend up there, the less dense your bones become. And so it was really fascinating to see what his studies were, his focus, and all of his interests, and why it makes a big difference to them, and all the differences between back when they first started space travel and exploration to today, because health issues are arising today that they didn't notice, 50 years ago, so to speak, when they first started, because we're able to be up there longer, which makes a huge difference. So that's why people like him are coming into play with NASA, because the health benefits for the astronauts are obviously a priority. The last presentation, and my personal favorite part of it, was definitely A Curious Life of the Mars Rover, which explained all the drones that we have sent to Mars and how long their intentions were and what their intentions were for each item. They displayed what happened for each landing, theoretically, because we don't have anyone there filming it, so to speak, but we do have models based off of what we've seen has occurred versus what we expected to occur. So they match up, so this is what they theorized, so they did a lot of CG to show us what had happened. For instance, the first few drones that were sent there, or rovers that were sent there, were all sent with massive airbags to soften their landing, versus the most recent rover, which landed with wheels down, no airbags, and primarily using jets to soften its landing, which is truly fascinating to imagine the amount of accuracy that goes on there. Now, communication between Mars and Earth takes approximately 20 minutes, so at any given time we have, the way we know things is over a 40-minute period almost, because it talks to us and we respond, and then it does what it's told, so to speak. And each rover had the intention of working for up to 16 months and then stopping after that, because they just weren't sure how long these could continue. But given their solar cells and everything that they can do, the first one of the first drones that we sent is actually still sending us information to this day, because it's still able to collect solar power and collect data. The others, and the most recent one that we've sent, also with all the intention of remaining there for 16 months, I believe have exceeded that by a minimum of 2 or 3 years. They're still going strong, essentially. The oldest droid that's still talking to us has been there for almost, for I believe a decade, solidly, a decade now. And they're very proud of it, and they are also creating a new Mars rover for 2020 to be launched. And so they went into all the differences that they're going to do with that one and what they're going to do to create it. And they went over all the really interesting things that the Mars rovers have all come up with. So after that presentation, we were able to look a little bit longer, but the place was closing up. I believe it was about 4 o'clock at that point. So we had a really full day full of really interesting items, and it was a fantastic free day. I highly suggest anyone who enjoys museums and enjoys anything about travel or flight or anything like that to definitely take advantage of those times. And that's it.